The first time I ever shut off the water to 300 families. I wasn't angry. I wasn't trying to prove a point, and I definitely wasn't looking to start a war with the neighborhood next door. I just locked a valve that happened to sit on land my family had owned for almost 140 years. 6 days later, the president of the Homeowners Association was standing on my front porch with a contract in one hand, an apology he clearly hated in the other. And suddenly everyone finally understood something my grandfather had spent his whole life trying to protect. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 30 years old, and until last spring I lived what most people would call a pretty boring life. I worked remotely as a financial systems analyst, spent my weekdays staring at spreadsheets, and my weekends repairing fences, feeding horses, and slowly learning how to take care of the Wyoming ranch my grandfather left me after he passed away. I'd grown up visiting every summer, but living there full-time was different. The silence was louder. The responsibility was heavier. Every old fence post seemed to carry a memory, and every evening I'd find myself sitting on Grandpa's porch with a cup of coffee, almost expecting to hear him laugh from the barn. He always used to tell me something that sounded ridiculous when I was a kid. People don't steal land anymore, Emmy. They steal rights. Back then I thought he was talking about politicians or corporations or something I'd understand when I got older. Turns out he was talking about neighbors. About a mile east of my ranch sat Silver Creek Estates, one of those polished subdivisions with matching mailboxes, perfect lawns, and enough HOA rules to tell people what color flowers they were allowed to plant. I honestly didn't pay much attention to them. They didn't bother me, and I didn't bother them. At least that's what I thought. Everything changed on a Tuesday afternoon when I opened my mailbox and found a certified envelope with a fancy law firm's logo across the top. Inside was a letter signed by HOA President Richard Holloway. According to him, I was interfering with community infrastructure by refusing to cooperate with neighborhood water access. They demanded I sign an agreement transferring permanent control of a natural spring located on my property to the HOA within 14 days or face immediate legal action. I remember reading that sentence 3 times because it honestly made no sense. Natural spring? I had lived on the ranch for 6 months and never once heard anyone mention a spring. My grandfather had never talked about one either, at least not that I could remember. My first thought was that they had mailed the letter to the wrong address. My second thought was that someone was bluffing. Still, something about the confidence in that letter bothered me. They were asking questions. They weren't negotiating. They were acting like they already owned something that supposedly belonged to me. That night, I climbed into the attic and opened every dusty box Grandpa had labeled in his neat handwriting. Survey maps, tax records, handwritten journals, yellowed photographs, even old receipts from feed stores that had been closed for 40 years. Around midnight, I found a rolled-up survey map from 1891 with little blue markings running through the eastern section of the ranch. Right beside one of those markings, Grandpa had written in red ink decades later, "Never surrender water rights." My stomach tightened. The next morning, I grabbed the map, my GPS, and started walking. It took almost 2 hours before I reached the far eastern pasture where the property sloped into a line of cottonwood trees. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of rushing water. Hidden behind thick brush was a beautiful natural spring flowing stronger than I ever imagined. But that wasn't what made me stop walking. Sitting directly above it was a massive concrete reservoir surrounded by chain-link fencing, electrical equipment, industrial pumps, and fresh maintenance vehicles. It looked like a commercial utility site, except every inch of it was sitting on my family's land. I just stood there staring, trying to convince myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe Grandpa had leased the property years ago. Maybe there was an easement buried somewhere in the paperwork. Maybe I was missing something obvious. Then I found the property stakes. Whoever built that facility hadn't accidentally crossed the line by a few feet. They were deep inside my ranch, far enough that nobody could possibly call it a surveying mistake. I took dozens of photos before driving straight to the county records office. The clerk recognized my last name immediately. "Your grandfather kept better records than anyone around here," she smiled. About an hour later, her smile disappeared. She looked back at me, then at the computer, then quietly printed several documents without saying much. Water rights, still registered to the Carter family. No lease, no easement, no transfer, no condemnation order, nothing. Then she pulled one final permit. The construction company that built the reservoir belonged to Richard Holloway himself. He had approved a multi-million-dollar water project on land he didn't own, connected an entire subdivision to it, and somehow nobody had ever bothered to ask permission from the actual property owner. I drove home in complete silence. Grandpa's words kept echoing in my head. People don't steal land anymore. They steal rights. Sitting in my truck outside the barn, I finally understood exactly what he had meant. And for the first time since inheriting the ranch, I realized I wasn't about to defend an old piece of property. I was about to defend everything my family had spent generations protecting. The next morning, I skipped work completely, made one phone call to my manager, told her I had a property issue that couldn't wait, and spent the entire day digging deeper because the more I looked at those county records, the less this felt like some paperwork mistake, and the more it felt like someone had built an entire business model around the assumption that my grandfather would never complain. Then I remembered something that made me sick. Grandpa had slowed down a lot during his last few years. His knees hurt. His eyesight wasn't what it used to be, and he rarely rode out to the eastern pasture anymore because it was too rough for his old pickup. If someone wanted to hide construction from him, that was exactly where they would have done it. I drove back to the reservoir carrying a tape measure, my drone, and every survey map I owned. The facility was even bigger than I had realized the day before. Fresh concrete, professionally installed pumps, backup generators, security cameras pointing outward, and a thick main pipeline disappearing underground towards Silver Creek Estates. Whoever designed it had invested serious money, and that only made one question louder in my head. Why would anyone spend millions building on land they didn't own unless they believed nobody would ever challenge them? While I was photographing another corner marker, a white maintenance truck rolled through the gate. The driver stepped out wearing a company polo with HOA infrastructure stitched over the pocket. He looked at me like I was the one trespassing. "Can I help you?" he asked. I smiled politely. "Actually, I was about to ask you the same thing." He frowned. "This is private property." I nodded. "You're right. It is." He looked confused until I pointed toward the survey stake barely 20 feet away. "See that orange marker? Everything west of it belongs to me." His expression changed instantly. He pulled out his phone, stepped away, and started making calls. I didn't wait around to hear them. Instead, I launched my drone and spent almost an hour recording everything from above. The footage was impossible to argue with. The entire reservoir, every access road, every electrical cabinet, every maintenance building, all of it sat well inside my boundary. That afternoon, I hired an independent licensed surveyor named Nathan Brooks. He spent 2 days verifying every measurement before handing me a report so detailed it looked like something prepared for federal court. His last sentence stuck with me. "There is no reasonable interpretation under which this facility is located outside the Carter property." Those words gave me confidence, but they also gave me something else: options. I still didn't want to fight. I honestly believed Richard Holloway would call, apologize, and work something out once he saw the evidence. Instead, 3 days later, I received another certified letter. This one accused me of interfering with critical community utilities simply by entering my own land. It demanded immediate cooperation and threatened damages if I delayed any maintenance work. I actually laughed out loud sitting at my kitchen table because the arrogance was almost impressive. They still believed intimidation would work. They still thought I was the inexperienced granddaughter who inherited a ranch and wouldn't know where to begin. What they didn't know was that Grandpa had taught me one lesson better than anyone else. Never argue with people who ignore facts. Just make the facts impossible to ignore. Early Friday morning, I walked back to the reservoir carrying a stainless steel padlock that cost less than $40. I found the master isolation valve exactly where the engineering plans said it would be. I checked my survey one last time, recorded a video showing my GPS coordinates, the property stakes, and the county documents sitting beside the valve. Then I slowly turned the wheel until it stopped. Water pressure dropped. I attached the padlock, snapped one final photograph, and started walking back toward my truck. 11 minutes later, my phone exploded. Richard Holloway didn't even say hello. "What the hell did you just do?" he screamed. "You shut down the neighborhood water supply." I leaned against my truck and answered as calmly as I could. "No, Richard. I secured equipment located on my private property." "You're committing vandalism." "Interesting," I replied. "Could you explain how someone vandalizes their own land?" He started shouting over me, threatening lawsuits, emergency injunctions, criminal charges, everything he could think of. When he finally paused to breathe, I said one sentence: "You should probably compare your construction permit with the county survey before your lawyer bills you by the hour." Silence. Then the line went dead. Less than 20 minutes later, another call came in. This time, it was an attorney. His voice was smoother, more controlled, but the strategy was exactly the same. He explained that restoring service immediately would demonstrate good faith while ownership questions were resolved later. I interrupted him. Would you like me to email the original water rights deed, the certified survey, roam footage, tax records, and county database showing 0 recorded easements? He hesitated. You have all of that already attached, I said as I hit send. And while you're reviewing it, look up the legal definition of trespassing and unjust enrichment. He never raised his voice again. By that evening, local television crews had arrived outside Silver Creek Estates. Social media filled with photos of residents carrying bottled water, kids filling buckets at temporary stations, and homeowners demanding answers from the HOA board. At first, the headlines blamed an unknown landowner for shutting off the water. I expected that. It's easy to blame the person everyone can see. But reporters started calling me for comment. And unlike Richard, I had receipts. I invited one journalist into my kitchen, spread Grandpa's maps across the table, showed her the county records, the construction permits, and the drone footage. She sat quietly for nearly an hour before finally asking one question. They built all of this without permission? I nodded. Looks that way. The story that aired that night wasn't about a stubborn ranch owner anymore. It was about whether a powerful developer had quietly taken private property and profited from it for years. Everything changed after that. By Sunday morning, county officials had begun their own inspection. On Monday, an engineering drone commissioned by the county confirmed Nathan's measurements almost exactly. Then, the first crack appeared inside the HOA itself. One board member resigned. By Tuesday afternoon, 2 more followed. Residents weren't yelling at me anymore. They were standing outside the HOA clubhouse demanding financial records. Someone leaked annual budgets showing thousands of dollars collected every month for water infrastructure maintenance. Suddenly, people weren't asking why I locked a valve. They were asking where all that money had gone, why nobody had disclosed the ownership issue, and who had approved building a community's most important utility on someone else's ranch. Every hour seemed to uncover another uncomfortable answer. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, I realized something almost funny. I still hadn't filed a lawsuit. I hadn't demanded damages. I hadn't even called the sheriff. I had simply refused to let strangers keep using something that had never belonged to them in the first place. And somehow that single decision had caused an entire system built on bad assumptions to begin collapsing under its own weight. Wednesday afternoon was strangely quiet. After nearly a week of nonstop phone calls, reporters parked outside my gate, and rumors flying across the county. The ranch almost felt peaceful again. I was repairing a section of fence near the barn when I saw a black SUV slowly coming up my driveway. It wasn't followed by another vehicle. There were no attorneys climbing out with briefcases, and there certainly weren't any deputies. Richard Holloway stepped out alone. He looked older than he had just a few days earlier. The expensive confidence he wore like a tailored suit had disappeared, replaced by someone who clearly hadn't slept much. He stopped a few feet away and looked around the ranch before speaking. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. I nodded toward the porch. "Sure, but this conversation stays honest." He gave a tired smile. "I don't think I have much choice anymore." We sat across from each other with 2 cups of coffee between us. For nearly a minute, neither of us said anything. Finally, he admitted what I had suspected all along. Years earlier, when Silver Creek Estates was first developed, drilling enough productive wells inside the subdivision had failed repeatedly. My family's spring was the closest reliable source. And instead of negotiating with my grandfather, Richard convinced himself the old man either wouldn't notice or wouldn't fight it. Construction started while permits described the location vaguely enough that few people questioned it. Then 1 year became 2, 2 became 5, and eventually everyone simply accepted the reservoir as community property because nobody remembered it had ever belonged to someone else. I kept telling myself I'd straighten everything out later, Richard admitted, staring into his coffee instead of at me. Later just kept getting farther away. I leaned back in my chair. "You weren't borrowing something, Richard. You built a business on somebody else's property." He nodded without arguing. That was the first honest thing he'd done since this whole mess started. I walked inside the house and came back carrying a folder I'd prepared the night before. He looked surprised when I slid it across the table. "What's this?" "Your best remaining option." Inside was a 20-year ground lease prepared by my attorney. It allowed the reservoir to stay exactly where it was, but under entirely different terms. Silver Creek Estates would lease the land for $6,800 every month. There would be $125,000 paid immediately, as compensation for years of unauthorized use. Every inspection, repair, tax, insurance payment, and maintenance expense would become the HOA's responsibility. If environmental damage ever occurred, they would restore my property at their expense. Then there was Clause 7. Richard read it twice before looking up. If payment is more than 5 days late, the property owner may suspend access to the facility for a minimum of 90 days. He sighed. You really expect me to sign this? I folded my arms. Now, I expect you to decide whether your neighborhood would rather explain another week without water. He looked out across the pasture for a long time before speaking again. Can we negotiate? I shook my head gently. You negotiated with yourself 5 years ago when you decided my family didn't deserve to be asked. Another long silence settled over the porch. Finally, he picked up the pen. I guess that's my answer. He signed every page. 48 hours later, the compensation payment cleared my bank account exactly as promised. My attorney confirmed the lease had been recorded with the county. Every legal requirement had been completed, and only then did I drive back to the reservoir. I stood in front of the same valve that had started the biggest fight of my life, unlocked the stainless steel padlock, and slowly opened the wheel until water rushed through the pipeline once again. I never celebrated. I never posted victory photos online. I never drove through the subdivision to see people's reactions. I simply went home, fed my horses, and watched the sunset from Grandpa's porch. 2 days later, Richard resigned as HOA president. A month after that, homeowners voted for an entirely new board and hired an outside accounting firm to review years of financial records. I wasn't involved in any of it. My fight had never been with 300 families. Most of them had absolutely no idea where their water came from or what had happened behind closed doors. My fight was with one decision made by one man who believed ownership only mattered when someone powerful was watching. These days, on the first business day of every month, a payment arrives automatically in my account. Every single time I see that deposit notification, I think about Grandpa standing beside me when I was 12 years old, pointing toward the eastern pasture and saying, "Never give away what you don't fully understand." Back then, I thought he meant the land itself. Now I know he meant something much bigger. Rights, boundaries, principles. Once people convince themselves those things are flexible, they'll keep taking until somebody finally says no. Locking that valve didn't make me a hero, and it certainly didn't make me popular for a while. It simply reminded everyone that respect for property and honesty in a community aren't optional, no matter how polished the neighborhood looks from the outside. So now I want to hear from you. If you discovered someone had been using your property for years without permission, would you have shut the valve the moment you found out, or would you have tried to negotiate first? And do you think Richard deserved a second chance after finally admitting the truth? Or should I have taken him to court anyway? Let me know what you honestly would have done, because stories like this always seem to divide people right down the middle, and I'm genuinely curious where you stand.